Well, good morning, everyone. It's time to get started with our Bible class. If you would be opening your Bibles to Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23, verse 13. Matthew 23, 13. Jared, would you lead us in prayer to start us off this morning?
Heavenly Father, we're so grateful and thankful that we could be here this morning, Lord, to fellowship, to come together with those of like mind, Lord, to dive into your word, to learn about you and to know how we can better ourselves and become closer together with you. Lord, we're thankful for this day. We're so thankful for your son. Lord, we had those among us, Lord, who have lost loved ones. We ask a special prayer for them, that you please be with them, comfort them, and during these trying times. Not just those, dear Lord, but those who are not here this morning, please bring them back to us when they feel better. And Lord, we ask that we have open minds and open hearts today, Lord, and help us to apply what we learned today to our daily walk. We thank you so much that you do for us, and we ask all these things in your son's name. Amen.
Amen. 2 weeks ago, we started talking about this section of Scripture. And in that first lesson, we had some questions that arose about the Sadducees. And so you may remember last Sunday, we devoted our class time to talking about the Sadducees and getting a better understanding of that division of Judaism. But with all of that in mind, I want us to get back to this text. And we're going to begin by once again reading this entire section of these 7 woes that Jesus gives to the Jews, because I want us to have these things fresh in our mind as we get into our discussion today. So let's begin reading, starting in Matthew 23, verse 13. But woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For ye neither go in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering to go in. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore ye shall receive the greater damnation. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye compass sea and land to make one proselyte. And when he is made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. Woe unto you, ye blind guides, which say, Whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing. But whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he is a debtor. Ye fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifieth the gold? And whosoever shall swear by the altar, it is nothing. But whosoever sweareth by the gift that is upon it, he is guilty. Ye fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifieth the gift? Whoso therefore shall swear by the altar sweareth by it, and by all things thereon. And whoso shall swear by the temple sweareth by it, and by him that dwelleth therein. And he that shall swear by heaven sweareth by the throne of God, and by him that sitteth thereon. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind Pharisee, cleanse first that which is within the cup and platter, that is the outside, or that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because ye build the tombs of the prophets and garnish the sepulchres of the righteous, and say, If we had been in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Wherefore ye be witnesses unto yourselves, that ye are the children of them which killed the prophets. Fill ye up then the measure of your fathers, ye serpents, ye generation of vipers. How can ye escape the damnation of hell? Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets, and wise men, and scribes, and some of them ye shall kill and crucify. Some of them shall ye scourge in the synagogues, and persecute them from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias son of Barachias, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. Now I know this is a lengthy reading, but I think it's important for us to have in mind all of the things that Jesus is presenting to the Jews as we get into this section. This term, woe, is an expression of grief. It is similar to the word alas. It's something that a person would say whenever they recognize that something was sad, something was devastating. You may remember the statement where the Apostle Paul said, "Woe is me if I preach not the gospel." He was talking about that this would be a sad thing indeed. It would be devastating to his soul if he did not preach the gospel. Well, here Jesus is expressing these exclamations of sadness because the Jews were leading people astray in these various ways. Now you may remember 2 weeks ago I mentioned the fact that in the King James Version we find 8 woes that are presented, but in most of your modern English translations you find only 7. And the reason that is because in some of the older manuscripts you do only find 7 woes. But in the manuscripts that were used when the King James Version was translated, we find that there were 8 that were included in those manuscripts of the New Testament. But regardless of the fact, if verse 14 was omitted from the oldest manuscripts, we find that this is still a biblical concept. It is still something that Jesus addressed in other places. Mark 12 and verse 40, Luke 20 and verse 47, this concept of taking advantage of widows and making long, wordy prayers simply as a show. Being there, saying these prayers so people would look at them and think that they were more holy than they really were. But we find that this is something that certainly has a fitting place in this list because it's something that the Jews were guilty of. Well, these 7 woes, we notice, are being addressed to the teachers of the law, the scribes, and to the Pharisees. In one of these woes, he even refers to them as blind guides or blind leaders. They were the ones that were supposed to be the religious elite, the ones that everyone was to be looking up to, that was to be the teachers of the people. But we notice then that he even goes so far as to call them serpents, snakes, a brood of vipers, indicating the evil, the hypocrisy that was a part of these individuals. But we find that prior to this, and this is why it's so important that we keep in context the things that we see. We see that up to this point, they have been trying very, very hard to trip Jesus up. They've been trying very hard to get him to say something that's contrary to their belief system so that they have something that they can use against him. They've asked him questions about divorce in Matthew 19. They've asked him questions about his authority in Matthew 21, about paying taxes to Caesar in Matthew chapter 22, about the resurrection. So we see that these were all issues that were hot topics of the day. These were issues that these scribes and these Pharisees were used to dealing with among the people. And they had developed their own interpretations of the law. Well, now they've come to Jesus. And they try to get him to say something that's going to trip him up. And so Jesus here, he prefaces these 7 woes by explaining that they need to be paying heed to the teachings of their Jewish leaders as they were taught in the law. That's something that we stress today, don't we? That we stick with what's in the Bible. We pay heed to those things that are taught to us, the way that we are instructed, so long as it is in keeping with the will of God. And that's what Jesus starts out by stressing to them. He says, you're paying heed to your leaders, but they're hypocrites. They're leading people astray. He says you need to pay heed to them only in the things that are in keeping with the law of Moses. But he tells them, do not emulate their behavior. If they're teaching you things that are right, then believe it. Listen to it. Learn from it. But don't emulate their behavior, because they're hypocrites. They're hypocrites.
The same thing is for today, too.
Yes, ma'am.
Watch what people are teaching.
That's right. That's right. And that's why we look at this concept. We see the scribes and the Pharisees, they weren't practicing what they preached. And we're going to see as we go through some of this, Jesus even acknowledges the fact that they were willing to go halfway around the world to try to bring one into their faith. They were willing to go to great lengths to bring a proselyte in. But then when they bring that proselyte in, the things that they teach to that individual makes them even more condemned than they were before. Puts their situation even worse than if they had never come to the faith. Well, why is that? Well, think about it this way. Here were individuals who now thought they were pleasing to God. Beforehand, they may not have even had a knowledge of God. They may not have even known that they were in sin, that they were lost, that they needed to do something. But now they were being brought in. They were told, this is what you have to do to be pleasing to God. But they were being misled. And once again, going back to what Miss Sue said, the same thing rings true today. How sad is it that we see so many in the religious world around us today who believe that they're saved, who believe that they're right with God. They've been led to believe that, and they're satisfied in their faith. How sad that's going to be when on the day of judgment, they stand before the judgment seat of Christ thinking that He's going to commend them for all of the good things that they've done, only to hear Him say, depart from me, I never knew you. And that's the concept that Jesus is trying to open the eyes of the Jewish leaders to. The fact that they're leading people astray rather than bringing them closer to God. And in these woes, we're going to see Him presenting some of the things that they were doing that were having this detrimental effect upon those that they were leading. Well, first, the first woe is that they were keeping people out of the kingdom. Notice He says that you're not willing to join the kingdom, but you're also keeping people out of it. Simply put, Jesus says you're keeping people from coming to me. You're keeping people from hearing the things that I have to say. He says, you're hypocrites. You have shut the door of the kingdom. You've shut that in people's faces. You're not entering. You're trying to keep people out that are trying to enter. People were coming to Jesus. They wanted to hear the things that He had to say. But their religious leaders were telling them, don't listen to this man. This man's crazy. He's not a prophet. He's not the Messiah. He's not anyone that you need to listen to. And these were the people that they respected. These were the people that many of them had been raised at the feet of, learning about their faith. And so they were leading people away from placing their faith in Jesus.
Well, usually when they teach stuff like that, they know just exactly how to word it to make it sound good to the ear. And so that's the main thing right there, is it?
That's right. That's right. You know, there's two ways that people evangelize. They either allow the word to convict, or they allow the ears to be tickled. Now we know that only one of those leads to true conversion. Only one of those leads to a person actually establishing faith. But there are many people, and I'm sad to say that there are many people even in the Lord's church today who believe that they're children of God, but their hearts have never truly been convicted. They're a part of the body of Christ because they like the things that they hear.
But what does the Lord say in the hymn? If they don't obey His word.
That's right. That's right. It's all about that conviction of the heart. If we are not convicted by the will of God and willing to make that change in our life, then we're not really children of God. But we have an epidemic in the church today. And that is, nobody wants to hear anything negative. Nobody wants to hear about anything controversial. We just need to preach those easy things, those smooth words, keep everybody happy, keep the seats filled, keep the collection plates just rolling over with money, and everybody's going to be happy and satisfied. That's the mentality of so many today. But also, that was the mentality of the Jewish leaders, wasn't it? We keep people happy, we keep our power. We keep people happy, they're going to keep contributing to the temple. We keep people happy, then we are going to continue to prosper in this life. But ultimately what it comes down to is we need to desire to keep God happy. We can't be a child of God if we don't desire to be pleasing to God. Now, I'm not saying that every time that a person gets in the pulpit or a person teaches a class that we're to be beating people over the head about sin. No. Sometimes we need positive words, words of encouragement, but we need to have a balance there. We need to have a balance because people need to understand the things that have to take place in their life, the changes that have to be made in order to be pleasing to God. Well, these were some of the very things that the Jews were keeping people away from. They didn't want them to hear Jesus. They didn't want them to come to Jesus because Jesus was teaching them things contrary to what they were teaching. And they knew that if people became disciples of Jesus, that they were going to stop being faithful Jews. That eventually they were going to depart from that faith. And they didn't want that. They didn't want to lose that influence. And so they were doing all that they could to keep people out of the kingdom. But also in this, we see that they were stressing a strict adherence to the law. But it was a strict adherence to their interpretation of the law. And it was something that they were expecting of everybody else, but not of themselves. They would teach it. They would instruct the young people in these things. This is what you have to do. And then they would go off and live their life however they wanted to live. This is where this concept of hypocrisy comes in. And this is also what keeps a lot of people out of the church today. Because a lot of times you see people that have no desire to be a part of the church because they see those who are supposed to be Christians living just like they're living.
It should be a lesson instead of just an object to reject and quit going to church.
Well, it should be, Sue, but a lot of people don't have the spiritual strength to see it that way. Whenever you have someone who is still lost, who has never developed any type of faith whatsoever, and they see someone who's supposed to be a Christian, who's supposed to be better than they are in the sense of morality and their codes of conduct, and they see them acting like everybody else, well, what's the point? If they're going to act that way and they're a Christian, then why can't I just keep going on the way that I am? And that's the mentality that so many have today. They don't want to come and be a part of the church because they see so many people as being hypocritical. And this goes hand in hand with this second woe that we see. In the second, Jesus is condemning these leaders for teaching their converts to be just as hypocritical as they are. They were teaching them to emulate the things that they were doing, the way that they were living their life. Look at us. Pattern yourselves after us. They were leading their converts into a religion of works, but not into true righteousness. They were giving them a long list of things that they had to do, but there was no real faith, no true righteousness there. And as such, Matthew 23 and verse 15 says that they are twofold, or twice as much a child of hell. Think about the gravity of that statement. Think about how powerful that is, that Jesus is saying, you're bringing people in who were lost. You're making them believe that they are now faithful to God when in fact they're not. When in fact they're hypocrites. He said this is twice as bad as it was before. Because now they think they're right with God when they're really not. Is it easier to convert someone who has no faith or someone who has a misguided faith? Typically someone who has no faith. Someone, to use a more modern term, someone who is unchurched. Someone who's not had false doctrine pounded into their heads. Because it's hard for people to comprehend that someone who is supposed to be holy is teaching us something that's false. It's hard to believe that. Especially if it's someone that we have strong relationships, strong feelings for. But these leaders were leading people into their own form. That's right. But as I said, if you start with someone who is unchurched, who has never been indoctrinated with any type of doctrine, it's easier to get them to see the truth of the gospel than if you have someone whose interpretations of the gospel have been developed even over years of study or years of being misled. And so these individuals were ones that initially they were unchurched. They were being brought in as proselytes. And the only thing that they were being exposed to was the teaching and the example of the Scribes and the Pharisees. And so they were being led in a direction away from God rather than closer to God. The third woe that we find pronounces these religious elite as being blind guides or blind fools, Matthew 23, verses 16 and 17. They saw themselves as enlightened. They saw them as ones who were opening the eyes of those who were lost, leading them to a better understanding of the truth. But their spiritual blindness was leading them not only to be ignorant of many things, but was carrying that ignorance over into their teachings and into their practices. They were blind to the true meaning of the Scriptures. They were not following the true meaning of the law of Moses. They were following their own ideas, their own interpretations that had led them away from that position. They felt that they were leading people to the truth. They felt that they were doing what was right with God. Well, Josh, how do you know that? Think about some of the things that the Apostle Paul said about himself before he was converted. Everything he was doing was what? Was in all good conscience. He thought that he was pleasing to God.
Well, you know, a cult leader is really good at swaying their followers into thinking they're doing the right thing. And, you know, look at some, this is kind of basically the same thing. They were, and they were the leaders.
That's right.
So, you want to believe your leaders.
Well, and another thing, and this is something that we really don't focus upon all that much, but we have to understand that up until 150 years ago, the majority of the world's population could not read or write. And they were dependent upon those that they saw as the educated. They were dependent upon them to interpret the Scriptures for them, to tell them what the Bible says. And so if you have individuals that they already recognize as being educated, these are ones that they admire because they can do things that I can't do. They're more educated than I am. And then they start teaching them about these Scriptures that they can't read. Then they're going to listen to the things those individuals have to say. There's going to be a lot more credibility in those individuals just simply based upon their education. Yes, sir?
How much more are we going to have to answer for today?
That's a good question.
We can read and write.
We can.
Yet we don't study enough. I don't study enough. I don't pray enough. I'm not a lot of answers for just like everybody else. We don't take the time we should.
And brother, in our society today, I think that we all could probably say that. I mean, we live in a very fast-paced, very busy time, and I'm right there with you. I know that I don't devote as much time as I should, and we all should say that. I mean, there's always more that we can do, more study we can put in, more time in prayer. There's always more that we can do. But as Jared said, and I think it's a very good, very valid point, how much more are we going to be held accountable because we do have the ability to read? We do have the ability to study the Scriptures for ourselves. Now, does that mean that someone 200 years ago that was led astray, that died in a lost condition because they were led astray is going to be saved? No, I don't believe that. But when we stand before the judgment seat of Christ, in a position where we know we could have studied the Scriptures for ourselves, we could have known the truth. If we stand there and we find out that we are lost, the gravity of that situation, I think, is going to be more severe for us. Now, there's some that believe, and I don't necessarily go this way, but there are some who believe that there's going to be various degrees of punishment in hell. I don't necessarily believe that, but I think whenever we look at it from the standpoint of the emotional aspect of it, not only is there going to be the physical pain, but if you're there and know that you could have avoided it, we think of the physical and the emotional strain that would have upon an individual. And so in a sense, we could say that there's going to be various degrees of punishment, but it's simply going to be different forms of punishment that's going to take place. We're going to have the physical, we're going to have the emotional, but also we're going to have the spiritual, that second death, eternal separation from God. But what was taking place with these scribes and Pharisees is instead of teaching spiritual truths, actually teaching the things that these individuals needed to know in order to live good, productive, and faithful lives, they were arguing over matters that really had no bearing upon their salvation. They were seeking to find loopholes in the rules, trying to find ways that they could get around different laws because, frankly, they didn't like some of them. But this was what they were focusing upon rather than the actual task that was at hand. Rather than teaching, they were trying to find new interpretations and new ways to get around things. We come to the fourth of these 7 woes. And he calls out the scribes and the Pharisees for their hypocrisy and the practice of tithing. Now, tithing is something that we do not engage in today because it was an Old Testament practice. You remember they were required to give 1/10 of their possessions, 1/10 of their money, 1/10 of their crops, 1/10 of the things that they had. Now, there are some that teach that this is still a requirement today, that we must give 1/10. Well, no. In the New Testament, we're told that we are to give as we've purposed in our hearts. We're to give as we have prospered. There's not a set amount that we're told that we are supposed to give. But notice what it says. It says they were making a big deal out of giving little things. Things such as spices. Spices. Now, certainly in that day and time, spices were a precious commodity. They weren't as readily available as they were today. You know, we can go to Walmart and we can find just about any kind of spice that we want to down one aisle of the store. Over there, they did not have that luxury, and some of these things were quite expensive. But they were focusing upon those things rather than upon crucial matters. They were going so far, and there were some of the Jewish historians that recorded this, that people were coming in and rather than bringing money to pay their temple taxes, or rather than bringing bulls and goats and birds to offer their sacrifices, people were bringing in bags of spices. And there were people that were set up there in the temple that would actually sit there and would count every leaf of mint. That would count every single seed of a certain type of spice to make sure they got exactly 10%. And they would use that as their sacrifice. So we see they were focusing on these little insignificant matters. Not to mention the fact they were accepting contributions of things that weren't acceptable. They were told what they were supposed to give, what they were to use as sacrifices. But notice here they were coming in and they were making a big deal out of little things. We don't ever do that today, do we? Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. I think today a lot of times we call it majoring in the minors.
It goes back to the widow's mind. The widow's mind. If you're supposed to give from the heart, and she had very little, but she got, you know.
That's right.
These men had a lot, but they're giving, like you said, it wasn't what they were supposed to be giving.
That's right. Notice that he says you're focusing on these insignificant things, that you're focusing on making sure that people are giving a tenth of mint, a tenth of the cumin that they have, a tenth of these of cooking spices. But yet you're not talking about justice. You're not being merciful. You're not worried about faithfulness. Helps us to see a little bit more why he calls them hypocrites, why he calls them blind guides, why he calls them a brood of vipers. Jesus said, what's happening, you're straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. Now, both of these are things that are unpleasant to think about. Probably all of us here have had times where we've accidentally swallowed a fly. Not a very pleasant thing, is it? Kind of tickles all the way down. Not a pleasant thing. But then think about it from the standpoint of trying to swallow a camel. This is the illustration that this is giving. Which one of those would be more bearable? Which one of those should be more significant? Well, he's using this illustration to help them see you're worried more about that little fly. Something that's not going to have a lasting effect upon you. He says, but you've got these weighty measures that are there. And this is something that you cannot possibly endure. You cannot possibly swallow a camel. But these are the things you're neglecting. The things that are truly important, that you need to be focused upon, these are the things that you're leaving by the wayside. Because you're worrying about those things that don't matter. They were so worried about committing the smallest infraction. You know, God forbid you leave out one leaf of mint.
The word that I keeps coming to me is they were inconsistent.
That's right. Absolutely.
They, emphasizing one thing over and leaving another But that last part of the verse, also so important, is that he says, these you ought to have done without leaving the others undone.
That's right.
So, yes, the small things are important. Jesus in fulfilling the old laws, and one tittle not, all be fulfilled. And so the little things are important. It's just that we can't just pick and choose what we want to emphasize.
That's right.
In our life, it's all of it.
That's right.
I think about our acts of worship that we're going to involve with. We know there are basically 5 acts of worship that we're involved in. Well, which one is more important? They're all important.
They are.
Can you leave?
They're all equally important.
But that's man's tendency to say, this is the most important. Well, when God doesn't say it's the most, all of it's important.
Right.
And anyway, just an example.
No, I think that's a very good point. Very good point. What Jesus was saying was not that they could leave anything out or overlook anything. He says, but you're making the little things major and the major things minor. He said, you need to focus upon all of these things, recognize that they're all important, and not neglect any of these things. Okay, we'll stop there for today. Next Sunday, we'll continue in this passage.